Hello, everyone. Welcome to the USAID Asia Counter-Trafficking in Person Summit from Evidence to Action, hosted by Winrock International. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Working Session, Cultural and Logistical Barriers to Research and Dissemination. We'll begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, just to let you know a few of the technical features available for you today. We're using Zoom meetings to enable as much interactivity as possible. Your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many comments and questions as we can throughout today's session. You will also be able to raise your hand to be acknowledged and invited to speak, and we will also be using breakout rooms today for a significant portion of the session, so you'll have lots of opportunities to get involved. To help us acknowledge you and your questions and inputs, please do rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window, hovering your mouse over your name, clicking more, and then rename. The meeting today will be recorded, but please keep your camera off unless you are invited to speak in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. Remember to continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags #WinrockE2A and #EvidenceToAction. Once again, you are in the session titled Working Session, Cultural and Logistical Barriers to Research and Dissemination. Okay, I think we are now ready to get started. So I'm going to hand the floor to Juliana Semyon, Communities and Society Research Associate at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Juliana, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Hermes. So hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining in. I know it's the evening for some of you, and we're kind of scattered across time zones, so thank you for joining us at whatever time of day you're here. I've really been looking forward to our time together, so I'm going to just dive right in, and I'll keep my own introduction brief because I know that you've got biographies that you can refer to, and we've been connected on the Microsoft Teams community a bit. But I do want to kind of highlight for now, just for our purposes today, that my own work sits right at the meeting point of policy, practice, and research. So for the last 8 years, I've been delivering direct victim services in the US and the UK. That's also involved some program development for those services. And I'm a researcher at the University of Nottingham, which is sort of the hat that I wear most of the time these days. But it's always been, my work has always been sort of in reference to what governments and what the third sector, what the private sector are doing to support survivors toward freedom. And so my work is a mix of our worlds, and that's why I had a personal interest in completing the report that we're talking about today. And I've got a really personal interest as well, and a professional interest in hearing your reflections on it during our feedback time. So the Preparing for Impact review that we're going to be discussing is a snapshot of really pragmatic cultural challenges and barriers to research uptake. It was based in the UK's anti-trafficking sector or anti-slavery sector, and our specific focus was on survivor support concerns. So stakeholders around the issues of survivor support are the ones who fed into this. But when the report was launched, it really resonated with people who worked in other areas. So the 3 Ps, if you're familiar with the 3 Ps that come from CTIP, the protection P is where victim support sits, or survivor support, as you might call it, sits. And so what I'm curious to know today, and curious to explore with you and with my colleagues from the Rights Lab and Metastory Institute, is how these findings resonate to other areas of the anti-trafficking agenda. Let me just lead off with a little bit of a description of how we're spending our time today, and then we'll dive into the report and into conversation with one another. So first thing is some key concepts and definitions. I'll talk about that as we get started. My colleague, Vicki Brotherton, is going to join me after my presentation for a quick conversation. She has a depth of experience from a variety of different sectors and really a perspective on nations and experiences outside of the UK as well. So she's going to help ease us into our breakout room time. Then we'll have about 30 minutes together in breakout rooms. So that's a really solid chunk of time to discuss specific issues, specific barriers to impact, and specific relationship or cultural values that need to underpin research and impact in order to make impact happen and make it sustainable. So then we'll come back together. I've got several colleagues who you'll be familiar with. Some of them have their biographies up on the agenda page, and you'll see them spotlighted later on in the session. They'll be leading each of those breakout rooms as facilitators. So while Vicki and I are talking, please be thinking about what breakout room you might be interested in going to. Think about what topics we're discussing, what barriers or what values really resonate with you. Then we'll come back together and learn from one another. We'll have kind of an extended feedback and discussion time. So let me share my screen with you and we will get started. All right, so I promised some notes on terminology as we get started. The first term that I want to talk about is modern slavery. That modern slavery in the UK is synonymous with the term human trafficking in US-based parlance. So as you hear modern slavery used as the terminology from different folks today, and as you hear human trafficking from others, please consider those sort of synonymous for our purposes today, because in the UK, modern slavery means the same thing as the US-based term human trafficking. And obviously this report was published in the UK, so it uses that UK terminology, but it's not in any way different or contradictory to what's meant by human trafficking. And also I wanted to make a comment on the topic of researchers and stakeholders. You might hear those terms used today. Stakeholders are evidence users. So in the report, we made the decision to use the word stakeholders. And what we mean by that is the large group of people who use evidence, who use the academic knowledge base or attempt to use the academic knowledge base that researchers produce. So I don't want to get too bogged down in semantics. It wasn't a statement about researchers not being stakeholders. It was just a way of dividing what the groups are when we talk about them in the report. So we're going to get started in the actual content of the report and introduction to it. The research question that the review set out to answer was, is the academic evidence base on support for survivors of modern slavery informing policy and the work of practitioners here in the UK? So in short, is evidence having an impact? Is it working? And the answer was that sometimes it works, sometimes it has an impact. But the question of impact here is really important because research often represents a huge investment of both time and money, but it's also important because of the nature of anti-trafficking. So the stakes of not having impact can be really high. If there's good evidence that informs how we could support survivors or how we could combat trafficking more effectively, but we don't use that evidence, we don't implement it, then researchers and stakeholders are at a disadvantage. And ultimately, the cost of not implementing good research is going to be borne by the victims and survivors who don't get that level up of support or that level up of care in whatever the different focus is that your organization might have in the anti-trafficking field. So there are 6 barriers to impact, and there are 3 cultural values, relationship or cultural values that need to underpin our work together in order for research to have an impact. I'm going to go through each of these, but I'm going to leave them up on the screen as I do so that you can continue thinking about which one you want to explore further in a breakout room. So the topic of access, let's start there. One access problem is that researchers are not effectively making evidence users aware of research when it's produced. So that's a dissemination problem. Dissemination can stand in the way of impact if it's not done effectively. And another example of an access problem is that some research still remains behind a paywall for a lot of non-academic readers, like government organizations or third sector charity or NGO organizations. So even if someone knows about research, they might not be able to access it because they haven't got the funds to pay for it. And so a lot of practitioners in the third sector and the government especially are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, even when good research is produced. So those are just a couple of examples to set up the access barrier. Now, when we talk about feasibility as the second barrier to impact, feasibility means that the recommendations that come out of research can seem really tone deaf to any practical constraints that evidence users have to work within. And so the recommendations out of research make the research kind of fall flat. It doesn't have any impact because if readers think that they can't implement the recommendations, The readers don't feel the onus is on them to go back through the research and invent new recommendations that they can implement. They're leaving it up to the researchers to name things that the research can do for the real world. What's the meaning of it all? So if researchers want to have greater impact, the idea here is that they need to understand the implications of the recommendations they make. So they have to think, what would a recommendation cost in terms of time or money or some other resource that might be scarce? And evidence users also have a responsibility to communicate what's possible. So especially if an evidence user is commissioning specific research or engaging with a researcher during a research project, it's important that those evidence users are clear about the parameters and constraints and how the research can work within that to make solid recommendations in a realistic way. Funding, that's the third barrier that we face. There are three main ways that funding relates to impact. The first is that academic research is expensive, so sometimes it never gets commissioned to begin with. If it never happens, then there can obviously never be any impact. The second is that implementing recommendations can be expensive. So sometimes, again, worthwhile research doesn't get applied because part of the feasibility problem from above is that some research recommendations are just too expensive to implement. And finally, researchers are often funded to produce work, but they're not consistently funded to see it through to impact. But researchers, on the other hand, or research evidence users, they don't have the time or the staff capacity to translate recommendations into operational plans. So that means if the researcher is not funded for impact and the evidence user doesn't have the money to make implementation happen, nobody is in charge of impact. So funding leaves a gap in both sides. The next barrier is preconceptions. So what we found in the report is that there are some negative preconceptions that different sectors hold about one another. And the report explores really specific preconceptions about the civil service here in the UK and in the research context. But these preconceptions, they can exist for really good reason. Like we might have actually had bad experiences with an organization in the past or with an individual. But the problem with preconceptions is that they stop us from engaging with one another in the future, or they stop us from cooperating well with one another in instances where we're kind of forced to work together. And so I wonder, as you talk about this in your breakout rooms, I wonder if the preconceptions issue is one that resonates with you. I wonder what preconceptions you might add to the list that the report talks about. And I wonder what other sectors are subject to preconceptions in your own anti-trafficking work, or if you feel that preconceptions against you or your organization are preventing impact in your own projects. The fifth barrier is relevance. And this means that evidence users don't think the research questions that are being asked are relevant, and therefore the findings and recommendations that come out of the research, they're not relevant. They might be feasible, they might be perfect recommendations, maybe there's even funding for them. But if it doesn't resonate with an evidence user, they're not going to spend their resources to implement that research. So recommendations lack relevance sometimes. Research doesn't speak to issues on the ground, as it were. And time is the final barrier. This is a really persistent barrier for almost every evidence user that I talked to. They said really bluntly, they just said, we don't have time to read research. So they want really succinct briefings. They want really succinct creative presentations, whether that's in a podcast or some sort of industry blog post or professional journal instead of an academic journal. They want researchers to think creatively and to be quick about getting their main message across so that their interest can be piqued and so that then the evidence users can justify spending more time reading and implementing the research. So let's talk about the three values that have to underpin impact. These three values speak to a shift in our attitudes toward one another that needs to happen in the anti-trafficking field. So the message that was really clear from researchers and evidence users is that if impact is to become more common in anti-trafficking work, then our relationships have to be characterized by collaboration, understanding, and respect. And this includes relationships with each other, but also with any survivors that we engage. So let's just briefly talk about what these three values mean to the people that I spoke to. Collaboration is more than knowing about each other, and it's more than being on the same committees or in the same task forces. Collaboration is active. It involves consistent and continual communication. It involves ongoing and meaningful engagement in one another's work. And it involves both parties, evidence users and researchers taking the initiative on different projects where they have capacity and responding to each other's initiatives. It's about listening to each other and making each other's goals possible. Understanding is the second value, and there's two elements to understanding. First, we need to understand each other's professional contexts and processes and any constraints that might be sounding familiar from some of the barriers above. And it's also essential, the second element here is that it's essential that we understand the world of anti-trafficking. So sometimes we can all come from the anti-trafficking from a huge variety of backgrounds. We might have a very diverse set of personal motivations and reasons that we're in our current roles. Some of us chose our roles, some of our roles were chosen for us. The list of ways we got involved goes on and on. But this means that sometimes we don't actually get any firsthand experience of frontline anti-trafficking work. So we don't actually understand what the other folks in our sector are trying to do or why they're trying to do it. We also don't understand what barriers they might experience. So it's really important that however passionate we are about succeeding in our project, or however much of a professional vested interest we have in the topic, it's really important that we understand it and that we try to get some firsthand experience and knowledge of it. So the final value that we need to cultivate for impact is respect. One application of respect that kept recurring in interviews is that we have to avoid treating each other as a means to an end. So for example, policymakers have been accused of using researchers and practitioners and even survivors as a means to getting a soundbite or as a means to justifying a policy move that they want to make. But this can be really objectifying from the perspective of survivors and practitioners and researchers, because a lot of times those policymakers are never heard from again. So researchers, for example, might put a lot of time into explaining a research project or even doing a new research project for policymakers. But as soon as the final report is handed over, that relationship is effectively severed because the policymaker can never be found again. And so in the worst examples of this kind of thing, evidence users might misrepresent where information came from, or they might take credit for information that they themselves didn't create. And that further harms the relationship in terms of respect and trust. So we really have to engage one another as professionals in our respective expertise areas. So now it's time for me to invite Vicki Brotherton to join me in a discussion about how these findings resonate with her own experiences in anti-slavery work. So again, as we're talking through these things, would you please just be thinking about what of these resonate and what of these you might want to discuss further in your breakout rooms. Hermes Huang will be preparing to send us into those breakout rooms, so you can use the chat feature to please list your top 2 preferences for topics. So it can be any of the values, any of the barriers, or a combination, but if you pick at least 2, we'll make sure to try and get you into a breakout room that is most relevant and most important to you. So I'll hand it over to Vicki for a moment. Vicki, could you start by telling us a little bit about your own background in our anti-trafficking field?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone, and nice to be with you. So yeah, I've worked in the anti-slavery sector for about 10 years now. My first role was at Anti-Slavery International, where I led a project that was looking at trafficking for forced criminal exploitation across Europe. I then moved to be the coordinator and researcher for the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, which is a coalition of 13 different anti-slavery organisations across the UK. And then I moved to the Office of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, where I was Victim Protection and Partnerships Lead, so I provided counsel to the Commissioner on those issues. And I've now been at the Right Side for about 2 years, I think, at the University of Nottingham, where I'm Head of Policy Engagement and Impact. So I lead on research, but I also help colleagues to think through the policy implications of their research and help them disseminate it in the way that will be most impactful. Oh, I can't hear you, Juliana. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thanks. Oh, I'm back. And Vicki, how have you seen those 6 barriers we talked about at play? Can you maybe share some examples that might take us beyond the survivor support scope of the report?
Sure, yeah, so I'm conscious of time. We don't have a lot of time at all, so I'm going to talk through the first 2, so access and feasibility. You say in the report that academics largely seem to expect stakeholders to reach out to them when they need evidence rather than proactively communicating their research to stakeholders. And I think this is definitely true in some cases. And it's certainly the case that academics don't regularly share short briefings that summarise the research findings and think through the recommendations. But I'd also say that it's also the case that academics don't necessarily have the right contacts in different government departments or different kind of key organisations to enable this communication. And not all academics, from my experience, are well versed in thinking through those policy implications of their research and the policy actors that might be interested in their work. So as your report suggests, Juliana, kind of having representation at sectoral network meetings and forums so they can make these contacts and share their research on a more regular basis is really helpful. But there's also been occasions where I have been asked to think through the policy implications of a particular piece of research and gone, that's not my area of expertise. So I'm thinking kind of most recently I was asked to think through how I would share a piece of research looking at the nexus between modern slavery, deforestation and climate change. And I'm not an expert in climate change or deforestation. But you know what? Google was my friend. And I just did a bit of kind of digging around about who the key institutions were at the national and international level, who some of the key contacts were. We wrote a short policy briefing. I shared it with people, but in a very like open palmed way. Like, I'm not sure if you are the right person, but we wondered if this would be of interest to you. Would you be interested in having a conversation? And I think it was really successful, and we got our kind of foot in the door with key institutions because I think we weren't presumptuous that what we were telling them was necessarily right or they'd be interested. So I think we have to be a bit humble sometimes in sharing knowledge. The second barrier I want to touch on was feasibility, and you talk about recommendations from research being having a lack of feasibility, and I totally agree that there's a tendency to be too vague or too far-reaching in recommendations, and I've seen that the more specific you can be, the more likely it is that policy actors and other stakeholders are going to take your recommendations up. And I'm thinking like really specific, so like as a result of these research findings, paragraph 32 of this particular piece of guidance needs to be changed to say X, just so that you can help people to practically think through the application of your research findings in their work. And they might not agree, but I think it's a good way to kind of start that conversation. But on the flip side of that, I would just end by saying that I think we do need to be far-reaching in our recommendations sometimes. Sometimes research indicates that we need whole systems change and not just tweaking around the edges. And if this is the case, then we need to challenge institutions about their direction of travel and offer them kind of broader solutions. But I would say that in doing that, we also then need to provide shorter term recommendations about how we get to that endpoint.
That's brilliant. And I love your suggestion that we don't necessarily stray away from what the research is saying if it's saying something big, if it's saying a big picture takeaway, but that maybe there's something we can focus on in the interim between now and the ideal world that we can actually sink our teeth into, or the evidence users can actually sink their teeth into. And so another question, just leaning into the topic of values now, how do those values of collaboration, understanding, and respect resonate with your experiences? And why do you think that they're important to research in anti-trafficking? And the final part to that question around collaboration, understanding, and respect is, to what degree do you think the field is characterized by those values?
That question is really difficult to answer, so I'll start with the easier ones. I think all three of those values are crucial to achieving impact, and I argue that they're crucial to everyday life and maintaining personal and professional relationships. In terms of collaboration, you talked about involving external stakeholders, policy actors in the research as early as possible. And from my personal experience, I've seen that to be really effective and really useful. Taking ideas to the people that might be able to use the research, to sense check ideas, to ask them about whether there's other data streams that you're not aware of, whether there's any kind of research questions or angles that they would like to see you answer. It basically creates like a landing pad for your research findings. They're invested, there's buy-in for your research before it's even begun. And I've also seen it from the other side of the fence. So working in the Commissioner's office, people used to come and talk to us about research pieces that they were doing. And that was useful for us to help shape their research, so it met our needs as well. And like I said, that landing pad was created. But then we could also then, in our conversations with other people, say, oh, by the way, were you aware of that they're doing this research? So we kind of, in effect, develop their network for those researchers as well. I think on the issue of respect, I think this is a really challenging one sometimes, because I think it has to work both ways. So like I said, we can't be presumptuous that people will be interested in our research findings. We have to, you know, go open palmed and keep people updated on progress as we go, you know, general good practice in communication. But honesty is a fundamental part of respect. And I sometimes feel that there isn't necessarily a full honesty around what the red lines are for external stakeholders and policymakers who might be using research. So, you know, they say they're interested in looking into a particular issue, and then the research findings come in and they're not used. And I think that leads to mistrust and frustration, particularly when that research involves survivors. And I think we need to just be a bit more honest about what's possible within the constraints that different actors are working in. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered that third question at all, but I think, yeah, I'll end there.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, and I think what you're saying resonates so much with what others have also indicated, which is that respect, yes, we all want to give respect 2 thumbs up, but it doesn't necessarily characterize our work right now. It's not something we can count on receiving from the other party. And sometimes the other party shouldn't count on receiving it from us, because we're not always good at demonstrating respect. Yeah. I think, as you put it, it is a two-way thing. Respect is definitely a two-way value. So final question for you before we go into our breakout rooms is, can you give us some examples of ways forward? So whatever your favorite ways forward are from what we've talked about, you know, or what's coming to mind, and yeah, ways forward to overcome these barriers, to cultivate these values. What do you want to see more of?
Sure. So in terms of trying to address the barriers, I find it's really helpful to try and get researchers to try and think about a simple set of questions. I frame these questions as I'm going to speak them as you already have the research findings, but they can be reframed to think of it, you know, before you've even embarked on research. Basically, ask these questions to yourself. Kind of, what new knowledge does your research bring to the field? Are your findings kind of totally new, or are you building on existing or known findings? Because that will help you think through how you pitch your research findings. What changes to policy, legislation, or practice would you like to see as a result of your findings? Who would be responsible for implementing these changes to policy, practice, or legislation? And are there likely to be any challenges or barriers to implementing these changes that are going to be faced by the people who are using them? And I just find that's a really useful way just to get people to think through and dig into kind of who the policy actors are that they want to influence. In terms of what I'd like to see more of, I'd love to see more just co-design of research, so collaboratively designing research projects with stakeholders, policymakers, and where appropriate, co-produce with survivors themselves as well. You mentioned in the report the buddying scheme that we've been running between the Rights Lab and the Home Office in the UK and what was the Department for International Development, where we paired academics with policymakers, civil servants, and allowed them to just meet over a number of times over a 6-month period as part of the pilot. And we've seen already that that's really been helpful for people to understand how the other party works, what their challenges are, what their interests are, the timeframes that they work to, etc. So I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more connection, more relationship building, because I think it's a really positive way forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for that wisdom from your many years of experience and diverse experience as well. And for the aspirations. I think that hopefully as we go into our breakout rooms, we've got a lot to think about aspirationally, as well as some very sort of pragmatic, maybe lowercase a aspirations that we can actually take hold of and be inspired by to make actual change. So as we sort of prepare to break up into our breakout rooms, I'm going to ask Hermes to spotlight all of our breakout room facilitators so that you can see the names and faces of the folks that you'll be engaging with. And again, if you haven't yet voted, as it were, in the chat for your top couple topics that you want to cover, the barriers and values, please do that now. Preparing for Impact, the report leans heavily on ways forward. And that's what we're going to be doing in the breakout rooms. We're going to be leaning forward, and we're going to be taking action after this summit's over. So one of the things that I really want to leave with you, because it was a big takeaway for me out of the report, is that impact doesn't have to be about grand gestures. So sometimes impact activities might be, you know, a diplomat showing up at an event and just bringing that level of prestige and making everybody motivated to either take action or be sanctioned. Right? Like there could be these sort of grand gestures that force impact or that inspire impact in a more positive setting. Public figures and celebrities might get involved in a cause or in a specific launch, but that's not always what impact is. Impact is really crucially a target that we need to be focusing on before, during, and after research activities. It's not just a grand gesture at the end of research to try and move it forward into the real world. It needs to be integrated. Impact needs to be integrated from the beginning as a part of what we're doing and expect to succeed at from our projects. And finally, contrary to needing to be about grand gestures, impact can be about commitment. That's actually what impact has to be about, because even the sort of grandest gesture toward impact or the grandest gesture toward cultivating a culture of collaboration, understanding, and respect, that's not going to take much root if we haven't got commitment from ourselves, whether we're evidence users or researchers, and if we can't garner commitment from the others that we're engaging with, right? It's a two-way street. It's researchers or evidence creators on one side and evidence users on the other most of the time. So again, we've got great colleagues who are here to help us in our breakout rooms. I'd like you to be thinking about one specific project that either you own or that you're working on, some project where you've got responsibility. Bring that idea into your breakout room, because we've got questions and discussions based around what impact and commitment can look like for you. So without further ado, Hermes, over to you for breakout room instructions.
Fantastic. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms here in just a second. Thank you so much for selecting your choices. I've done my best to put you into your choices and otherwise balanced out everyone else. You'll see a notification that will push you into the breakout room. If you don't see that immediately, you can go ahead and maximize your Zoom window, and that will bring up the breakout room button at the bottom of your screen, and you click there. But hopefully what will happen is you'll go automatically into the room. So you'll see a significant sort of switch in your view. Don't be alarmed, give it a second, and you'll be in the right place in just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms now. You'll have 30 minutes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hermes. Well, I hope everyone's breakout time was fruitful. And thanks to Hermes for giving us that whole 30 minutes. And we're sort of back on track, which is good. It went by really fast, at least from my perspective, and there was so much more that we could have dug into. So right from the outset, I want to encourage everybody to make use of the Microsoft Teams community that we're in. If you've got follow-up comments, if you've got different commitments that you want to add or make, please use that space. My email address is also online, so feel free to email me if you would prefer email over Teams. I don't have a preference. So please feel free to continue engaging with us and reaching out, especially during the summit and in the days that follow. Please don't feel the conversation has to end just because we've been pulled back into a big room together. But since we're here, I'd like us to have some extended time now to reflect on what we discussed and to hear from each other, because we all sort of dived into a focus on one or two barriers and values. And now we're back in the big room to see how it might fit together and to learn from each other's perspectives. So this is really a time for you to feedback. If you would like to speak up when I pose a question, please use the hand raise feature, or if you can't find that, you can just use the chat to make note of yourself. Please don't write a whole message in the chat, because then I won't be able to necessarily facilitate watching and listening and reading, but please just make a note that you've got a response, and we'll be happy to let you unmute and share with us. All right, so again, first as I get started, I just want us to be thinking about the first question for each of you. I know that you've got spokespeople from your group, so this is posed to the spokespeople on behalf of each breakout session. How did your topic resonate with your group? So how did the topic you were discussing resonate? How was it relevant to you?
I've just allowed people to unmute themselves. So if you are a spokesperson for a group, then you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks, Hermes.
And I mean,
Does
I think I
anybody
made
have a-
myself the, oh, sorry. Actually, I made myself the spokesperson for our group. So just to say, people, we had some really great contributions. Thanks to people who contributed. People really felt that it resonated with them in terms of their experiences of trying to secure funding. And then we ended up having quite a big discussion about another barrier to cost barrier, which was just forms and bureaucracy and having to pay registration fees and having to put in so long it takes for the requirements funders have to for a huge amount of paperwork, and that is a cost both from kind of academics but also on NGOs, and particularly smaller NGOs. And we had an interesting conversation about whether that's one of the reasons why big funders fund big third sector organisations and the smaller ones don't get as much of a look in, and part of it's about proving track record, and part of it's just about having those mechanisms in place to and already being a kind of trusted partner. How we break down that kind of barrier for smaller groups doing really great on the ground work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen.
I'll be the spokesperson for our group and try to avoid picking up on so much of what Helen just said, because I could talk about funding for this all day long. Yeah, there were a couple of contributions in relation to how sometimes it can be difficult because you don't necessarily know who the particular stakeholders are going to be on a piece of research in advance. There was an example given of a 4-country research project, and at the time of project design, only 2 of the countries were known. So while there was a desire and an inclination to engage the relevant government actors, it wasn't actually possible. That said, there were efforts to kind of reverse engineer it once the countries were identified and the projects were underway. And there were kind of similar kind of considerations or challenges that you might expect at the start that were encountered, as in kind of a certain amount of government concern around potential critique from the research, but, you know, meaningful engagement, and they felt the relevance of it as well. Then there was another example of and a couple of people contributed on and mentioned the kind of significance of the gaps in research, and sometimes finding it maybe a bit difficult to identify the individuals to connect with in order to collaborate. I think there was maybe I read into it a little, please keep me honest and correct me if this wasn't intended, but maybe a bit of a responsibility on research institutions to make themselves known to civil society organizations, different kinds of entities that may be able to benefit from research. And then the time factor again around the fact that people have so much to do, and that there is so much to do, it is always a case of significantly and severely competing priorities.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leisha. And just as a reminder, your group focused on collaboration. So just to sort of frame all of that for everybody. I'm curious about the feasibility and relevance group. Who is your spokesperson? And did feasibility and relevance sound relevant to you as barriers in your own experiences?
Yeah, I was moderating, and I tried to summarize what all of us tried to discuss. We had a good discussion. People from Nepal and Philippines, USA, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, all kinds of, and all of them, I think we found that this question about relevance and feasibility of research and how to connect with stakeholders is extremely relevant. So we had some good examples, for instance, of the Philippines, how there's some funders among us. They were trying to facilitate research and really connecting with governments, not just in quick and dirty, that was the word used, quick and dirty proposals for very concrete things, for instance, like on video interviews with victims now in COVID times, and breaking through that this became possible even now, and relevant for the long term. This is one concrete example, which can come through with small research and with just trying out. And on the other part of the spectrum, some people from Portuguese, for instance, or from Rindruk suggested that to do all this research long term, we need both junior and senior involvement on the research side, and a broader connection even with government people and people involved. Parliament members were mentioned, on what actually they want on the long term to be researched. So sometimes the questions of what and the changes in policy and in policy regimes that are in our different countries are happening, how to facilitate those and even anticipate with the research to make it relevant and to make it feasible. That's issues that both funders are very interesting. Funders are really looking for to fund those kinds of research, and stakeholders, in my own experience too, from Parliament and from other institutions, they are looking for longer term systemic changes and research on those areas all the time. And then of course there was mentioned that, and this is it's so relevant, this remark, I don't, was it Ellie, I think, in our group said, she's been doing research for 20 years back in Eastern Europe, and when she comes back there, she finds that all those issues are still there, meaning all the research that is done maybe should be implemented, and we can look at all the research and dig up things just to find out that there's some both best practices and there is some real systemic things that still need to be overcome. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna summarize what we did.
Thank you. That's incredibly relevant, not only to your to the two barriers that you discussed, but to the whole seminar. I almost feel like we could just close on that note. There's the argument for impact right there.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. So I'm curious, Anna, about preconceptions. You talked about preconceptions as a barrier and also the value of respect. So you sort of had, as in baseball terminology, you had a double header. So what did those resonate for in your group? Or you might have another spokesperson, so if it's someone else, they can speak up too. But how did those resonate in your group's experiences?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am the spokesperson of my group as well. In our group, it did resonate. I think it is a very broad theme that is at the edge of other themes as well. So we also touched things related to funding of Helen's group, and that lack of funding is sometimes based on lack of interest by institutions that may come from a lack of or not appropriately communicating the importance of research and the problem. And also some very interesting examples were highlighted, such as sometimes some projects are designed for a short term, so you provide some short term training, but it is difficult, or you don't oversee how to implement that in the long term. So that hinders effectivity, because you have that training, but then you don't have anything else, and you don't promote further engagement, and that affects to impact. So, and also one last thing, we also add some preconception that either from the NGO, the stakeholders, or the academia can come from, is towards victims, and our preconception towards them that can affect research and how we implement it. And that was it.
That's brilliant insights. Thank you. And so important. I feel like everything that's kind of being reflected is further argument for why impact is important, if we needed convincing about that. And also almost everything you're saying from these breakout rooms also feels like a good final word on the topic, but don't worry, I won't just cut us off and end us early. So I would like to ask a second question now, and that question is, were there any positive examples that were shared in your groups about overcoming barriers or about cultivating a culture of collaboration, understanding, and respect? Some of you have touched on this, which is great. So it's a good segue, I think, into that. Can we start with the access and time group?
Yeah, I think feeding back from our group, a lot of the points raised in the report were resonated heavily with everybody in the group. And we went through a couple of specific examples where it wasn't said outright, but you could see access was an issue, trying to find this information was an issue, and the time spent or the time needed to be spent was an issue. You know, a lot of this work had to be done immediately, and it couldn't. A lot of time was spent on this. In terms of commitments made, we didn't have too many researchers other than myself in the room, but some great suggestions were made on how access and time barriers could be reduced, and that bridge between researchers and stakeholders facilitated more. One of our participants talked about researchers being more intentional on how they disseminate research, and we even suggested a specific, in the interest of being succinct, a specific idea of working with USAID maybe to convene a forum of researchers and stakeholders, specifically looking at how they bridge that gap, specifically looking at what evidence can be produced or what evidence is wanted to be produced, and so like you said in the report, make that impact early, build it into the project. Something that came up a lot that doesn't come up in the report so much, and it's probably because of the UK nature of the report, but a lot of the research is Western centric, so a lot of it it's not as easily applied in other continents, other contexts, and also something else on the language, not necessarily the physical language, but the density of language used can be quite hard to penetrate. A lot of researchers like to be sort of quite wordy. They like to present data in a certain way that someone said it makes people feel so dumb, and it obviously doesn't help with that bridge and doesn't help translate research into impact. So yeah, something about reducing the density of that language.
Great, thank you. That's really, really practical. And that actually came up in our group too. We talked about understanding, and in a related commitment that was made, and a positive example of overcoming a barrier and of understanding. Michelle, I'm wondering if you could reflect on what you talked about in terms of how you've built in understanding from the beginning.
Yeah, we were talking about how we're working on victim identification research, and it just really hit me while I was listening that, we had a plan to do some consultations before the research really kicked off, and to do an in-depth literature review to really refine the research question. But I thought, I don't think that's good enough. I think what we need to do, and we've got a great research team out of University of Sussex at IDS, and they're great because and they're very adaptable, and I like them a lot. But they so I think the key message there is to actually work very closely with our counterparts in the countries, the bilateral projects, and say, okay, where are your research gaps? How will this research, or where are your knowledge gaps? How will this research help fill those gaps? And and can we build together some sort of I would say like a contract is the word I used, but that says, this is the research we'll produce, and, and this will be, and this is how you'll change your programming or change your responses, or these are the areas you're in a position where you're able to, or, something where we can really figure out, very, very concrete, actionable, like research questions.
Brilliant, thanks. And Helen, were there any examples in your group of positive examples of overcoming the barrier of funding?
I think one thought we'd all had is like how much funding is going to be impacted by the current pandemic. But I guess there was a good commitment from a bird who's in Purnata in India to say that the project they wanted and they have had struggles to get funded is now proceeding. It's just maybe 4 years later than they'd hoped, which is a real shame. But it's a great sign of kind of committing to carrying it on. And then Lani talked about this great project that she and two colleagues have set up, partly in response to the pandemic, but also partly in response to some of these barriers of just ways of reaching out to business. So I felt like Lani maybe should be hooked up with the business program at the Rights Lab, see if they can both learn from each other on that. So trying to form a coalition to get the business community involved as like a different source of funding, because appealing to their self-interest. There's laws that they might not be aware of in the Philippines. That's where Lani's based. So making them aware of those laws and then working with them to try and stop trafficking happening in their so talk about tourism business or stuff happening in their hotels and or somewhere in their supply chains, etc. And also kind of thinking about highlighting the negative implications for trafficking, the risks of it, the kind of legal risks of it, and then the fines and everything, but also about reputation. And we had quite an interesting chat about whether companies are kind of willing to go into this concern about the cost of reputation to them, and then we were on to cost of bureaucracy. So I think, you know, a great plan for action that maybe is bypassing the need to keep applying for government funding and going directly to business, but then there'll still be all these difficulties that we faced about bureaucracy and trust and collaborative work. But I think it sounds like a great plan because they're very appealing to obvious self-interest on the part of businesses in the Philippines who need to be taking this issue seriously, as there's now legislation to be enforced there.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, even though I know that there were probably so many additional rich conversations that we could draw out at length here. I want to ask a couple people just in closing for additional comments. So first, I want to go to our breakout room spokespeople. If you haven't had a chance to share, the third question for you then is how would you be able to give any examples of commitments that were made to impact? And you don't need to name specific individuals because obviously I haven't asked if we can do that, but are there any examples that you can share generally out of your breakout room that say someone made a specific commitment to do something, much like Michelle has made a commitment out of the room for understanding to continue that project of really building into a project from the beginning, understanding what the evidence user needs and how they could use evidence. That's one example from our room. So can we actually go to Tame? Do you have anything that you'd like to add in terms of an example for a commitment?
I think one of our commitments was spoken out to keep continuing talking with government and involving them in the earliest stage of research design. And this was done from the need of a funder that has these connections, but also that's something that they feel that the field themselves also think it's really relevant, makes it really relevant. So there's commitment there. And I was thinking of another thing, but now it jumps from my mind, of course, when I think of it.
That's okay. You can drop it in the chat if it comes to you.
Yeah, let me do that. Let me do that.
Anna, have you got any examples that you can share? Maybe just one example of a commitment.
Yeah, well, we had a very general commitment that they will try to think in the possible challenges that may face for impact on survivors in the decision-making process of the project. So it's more a broad commitment of noticing it.
Thank you. And that really does speak to your topic of respect too, doesn't it? Respect for the survivors involved and respect for the parties who contributed. Finally, Leisha, can you give us an example from your group? And again, your group talked about collaboration.
Yeah, there was one commitment to continue to work with the various stakeholders after a piece of research had been published. And then there were two pairs of commitments for participants to connect with each other. So yeah, very direct commitments out of that.
That's fantastic. And it's a great segue into what I was about to say next, but I'll hold my thought. Vicky, are there any final encouragements that you'd like to give us after hearing these reflections? Any final encouragements you'd like to offer that tie back into our conversation at the beginning?
Yeah, just to listen to all of that, really interesting. And just the key theme that kept on coming out for me was like communication is key to impact. Like Leisha says, communicating what your research institute does, what your evidence gaps are, what your research needs are, communicating about your project when it's being developed, communicating your findings, emerging, final, keeping in touch with people once the research findings have come out, and communicating what your barriers are to using research and producing research. So yeah, just keep talking, particularly in COVID times when we can't be all together, just thinking of ways to keep those conversation channels going.
Thank you. So I will just leave on a logistical couple notes. I will be following up with those of you who have made commitments toward impact. We'll be following up to see how I can support you and how we can maybe brainstorm to make those commitments happen, to make those feasible for you, and to just check in on how it's going, because impact is something that I think is evident from these conversations impacts all of us. And it's relevant to all of us, and the failure or success of impact is relevant to all of our work in one way or another. So thank you so much for joining us. And the one thing that I was going to tie back into Alicia's comment on is that we've got a grant competition running for the summit. The information is in the Microsoft Teams community. It's got its own channel, and there's also a link on the homepage of our website for the summit. So if you've made connections with others here at this session, that is an opportunity for you to show that you're making a commitment toward impact, toward evidence moving to action, and that you would like to ask for some funding. So let funding not be a barrier to your collaboration with one another, because there's an opportunity to apply. I'm happy to engage with further questions, whether it's about grant application queries. If you want to engage together on that, that's great. If you'd like to engage with one another or with people from other sectors and other sessions, absolutely encourage you to do that. And feel free to reach out, and you'll hear from me if you've made commitments, so I'll reach back out to you. Hermes, is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
And I think that's all. I can go ahead and close this out here. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session. Please do join us at the other sessions in the summit, and you can find all of those links to tomorrow's sessions in your participants guide. We have 2 sessions starting off tomorrow morning, one at 9 and one at 9:30. Unfortunately, they aren't in parallel because of speaker schedules, but we've got systemic causes and disincentivizing risk, thinking beyond traditional approaches at 9, and social behavior change communication, experiences in Asia at 9:30. So please do join us and continue the conversation, like Juliana was saying, on the MS Teams community, especially if you're finding collaborators for the pitch competition. So again, thank you so much for your participation today. Have a great day, have a great morning, have a great evening, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.